Great. Roxane?
For me, whenever I read, it's all about being transported. I read to escape. I do. I read Clive Cussler, whatever. I want to have fun. And so when I think about what a story is, especially as an editor, it's about investment and engagement. How am I getting people to pull into this story, feel something? I think that writing from emotion is, for me, the most interesting kind of writing. So I don't care if your story is 25 words or 25,000 words. Do I feel something? Do I feel invested? Do I not want this to end? Is it more than just a pretty turn of phrase? Is there something in there for me to hold on to, both intellectually and emotionally? And so it always comes down to me for a story is something that I can both feel invested in and engaged with.
Hi, can you hear? Okay. Well, it's interesting that the word anecdote came up as well, and story and anecdote. My teacher was very clear about the stuff that I was doing when I was a grad student. I wasn't writing stories, and the word we came up for was fiction. That I was writing short fiction, and I think that's right. I mean, for him, technically, the story was, and this is a writer named John Barth, a story had that Freytagian upside-down check mark that has a ground situation, a rising action that is marked by that wonderful phrase, one day, and then the rising action and the climax and the change of character from the beginning of the ground situation to the end. And it is what I discovered out, and he would call then that ground situation before the one day, anecdotal. You can make it more interesting. I mean, the conflict is already there, it just hasn't been set into motion. So the ground situation for Snow White is evil queen with the mirror, Snow White in the scullery. I mean, you could say that Snow White has a dog named Pug, she has 6 toes on her left foot. I mean, that becomes more interesting, but that isn't a story. It's not until the one day when the mirror says, you're no longer the fairest in the land. Then the story, then you can feel a kind of narrative, linear on rush. And me, I stick with that A to B. I just love the ground situation, the melodramatic sort of complication. And that's how I make a distinction between, and the phrases I use is story and fiction. Short fiction, but I wanted to move, slightly now the other way. And I think it's interesting at the AWP that so many of these panels places, all of us are writers, but places us in a situation which I think is really criticism. That is, we're all about genre distinction. The first question is this a story, is this a poem? You express a kind of pushback to this, no, this is that. I just think, I'm going to get on a soapbox here and say, I think as writers, we have to be very careful going into the university, which is a critical machine, with departments and slice this way, genre this way, genre that way. And that the one way to look at kin fiction that I think is sort of interesting is why is it that these things develop? Now he says, well, I think it's actually Hermes speaking here. That when criticism becomes too intense, the artist in you, the writer in you, actually looks for ways, you look for genres that confound genre. Kin fiction cannot be described. And we're sitting here as a lot of us are teachers, professors in universities thinking, well, yes, we have to start writing criticism about what is this thing, what function does it do? No, I think our job is to not even worry about that, is to make things and let the people, your colleagues in the literature, let them figure it out. In a way, I'm no longer playing with the idea of what is this. I don't care. It's not my job. My job is to just make things. And it's somebody else's job to do it. So I think, sometimes, because we're in universities, and those guys look so professional, and they're so, yeah, I can do that too. I can be rigorous. Hell with rigor. I'm all here to promote, as our patron, Hermes or the trickster. Anytime somebody says, what's this, what's that, what are you doing? I don't know. I mean, remember what Hermes did was, right, he stole the cattle of Apollo, and then he finally was caught. He was a little baby. Oh, I didn't do it. And then to Apollo, great artist, Apollo. Do you remember what he did to appease Apollo? If you remember, you don't remember your classic. Oh, you got it. He made the lyre. Okay, so this baby Hermes, who just stole the cattle, in order to calm down the pissed off Apollo, made a new instrument. Now, he couldn't play it. I mean, it was Apollo who's the great musician, who said, oh, I love this thing, this is great, now I can become a musician and the artist. But it is Hermes that made the lyre. And I think what's interesting about this anthology, or the flash fiction, is to be a kind of writer where you make something that's never been made before, an instrument that's never been made before. So for me, that's the function of this literature, to confound are also that critical desire to put it into categories, to tame it. So.
All right, I think that's done. That's really great. What I think is very interesting too about just stories of this length is also just so much more relies on the reader. And there's criticism out there that says basically that means that as the writer you're just being lazy. You're making the reader do pretty much 99% of the work. But it's not easy at all. I read somewhere online that someone said that they wrote their own fiction story. It took them about 5 minutes, so it shouldn't take anyone more than 10 minutes to write a story. And I don't know, I can't speak for any of the panelists on here, but I know for my own, when I write very, very short fiction, it's a huge process, a very long, drawn-out process, where I might have an idea, or I might have an image, I might have a character, and I'll come back to it. I don't just sit down for an hour or two, or for 5 minutes and just write the story. I might write it, I might come back, and it's kind of creating that perfection. Every word is just, it has to be perfect, it has to be right. Because in a length, this size, any misstep is awful. And that actually kind of goes, I'll just skip ahead, how that kind of does the same thing with poetry. In poetry, every word has to be the same, or it has to be perfect. So what's the distinction here then between hand fiction and haiku? Because a lot of people, that's one of the main questions I usually get, like, well, what differentiates this from haiku? And normally I would say, well, haiku's verse, hand fiction prose. But I think it's actually more involved than that. Let's head down this way.
Difference, back to the critical question. Difference between haiku and the other thing you brought up was the amount of time one spends on anything. And I've always found that I can never sort of associate that. I can work very hard and very long in a very short thing, and it still not sort of comes out in the way I want it. I mean, for me, I think there's, isn't that true of you? I mean, if we could just say, yes, to write this, it'll take 10 minutes. Well, you never know. I mean, sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it takes shorter. And there is also that argument against each other, that the sort of Arnold notion of best word in best order, as opposed to first word, best word. And I guess where I am right now has to do with being at sort of first word, best word. Again, back to the Greeks. The mom and dad of the muses, Zeus, always a safe bet to say Zeus, he was father of everybody. The other side was memory. And so, allegorically, what is that saying about the art that we produce? It's a mixture of a kind of rational thought as well as this sort of unconscious thought. And I think, both haiku and hand fiction participate in a kind of modulation of those two impulses. Something that is given to you, you're sitting there quietly, something is given to you out of the unconscious or memory, and then the other part of you begins to shape it in a way that you want to shape it. I mean, to be sort of specific about it, I think haiku, in some ways, has it going for itself because it has a lot of rules, especially in the Japanese. Certain kinds of things are prohibited from being included in a haiku, whereas hand fiction, again, I think is much more in the kind of Hermes vein, wide open. It's making it up itself as it goes along. But haiku seems to me to be a formal grouping of words, and a very highly formal grouping of words with very specific and agreed upon conventions.
I would basically agree with what he said. I mean, with haiku, it's really about the formal restriction. But there is a formal restriction to hint fiction where you have these 25 words, but you can do anything with those 25 words. And you don't have that flexibility with haiku. And so it's really like a recipe versus a dish. You have the recipe for haiku, but with hint fiction, you can make the dish any way that you see fit. And so it's really about thinking about the ingredients that you're going to be using in this dish with a hint fiction story. And you really just have a lot more flexibility. I mean, I'm not a poet, but a lot of poets really struggle with haiku and, how can I create something that's evocative and meaningful while following these formal restrictions. And with hint fiction, you have to work just as hard, but there is a lot of freedom in that. I can tell any kind of story I want, and so I use actually hint fiction in my teaching to teach students in professional writing how to write with brevity. And because in the business world, we're programmed to teach our students that people don't have time to read. And so I tell them, I need you to read these stories, and then I need you to write me a memo in 25 words or fewer. And they still have that freedom. There is that one restriction, but you can do a lot with that freedom. And you can try and convey as much meaning as possible. And it's really about creating that sense of meaning. And so that's what I would do with the difference between the two.
Just to go back to what Michael said about that we create things. When I first started writing these very short pieces, I wrote them without knowing that they existed out there. I just sort of started writing them and sending them out to journals. And I sent them out to without a label on them. And it was an interesting experience with journals, not quite sure knowing what to do with them. So sometimes when I would get the call back, they said it bounced from the poetry editor. I would start with the fiction editor said, this is short, and the poetry editor said, well, it's not really poetry. It doesn't do the things I think poetry, and we'd go back and forth. And so I do think that is one of the recent things that excites me about these very compressed forms of fiction that don't have labels. And I think that a label is, it makes sense for Norton to call it something, to sell it, and have it be something. So I think it makes more sense when it becomes a product that needs to be defined. But I think for the writer itself, it's not that essential. But Steve Allman had this quote, which I like, about writing. He said, writing is decision-making, nothing more and nothing less. What word, where to place the comma, how to shape the paragraph, which characters to undress, and in what matter. It's relentless. So I think that the writer of the haiku would probably has different decisions to make and different questions to ask than the writer of the hint fiction. And then I think someone who gets the call that Norton is looking for hint fiction, and you say, really, Norton, hint fiction? Aren't those the big giant? That's very cool, And there's 25 words or less, and that's all that it gives you is 25 words or less. I think that the ones that seem best seem to be the people who come up with questions that are important to themselves as artists to ask that piece. It might be, what is the perfect word for this plot? How do I make something that's 25 words or less have an emotional resonance at the end? Is there a way to get backstory through the title? And and it's relentless, these questions. But I think that the questions that I ask from hint fiction would be different than Roxane and Daniel and Robert and Michael asked. And then from hint fiction to hint fiction piece, I think you get bored with some of those questions. Just like some of us who were drawn to these very tiny forms got bored with the drawn-out middle of narrative, where they act and fail, and act and fail, and act and fail, and they better get an epiphany soon, because I'm running out of act and fail. Every now and then you get a little tired of it, so there were these other forms that didn't seem to be as defined, and they did have, from my mythical little knowledge I retained, there is a Hermes feel to it. I like that sense of it.